Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, I am so pleased to be diving into the romantic comedy. We always begin these lectures with this question of why read a certain book. I recently was with a bunch of 20-somethings, which honestly is a little startling because my eldest child is about to turn 28 years old. I always think of them as being like in their early 20s, and all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, they're in their later 20s. But I was struck because two of these young women who are 27 years old were reading Heartburn by Nora Ephron. My point of reference for Heartburn was the movie that came out in the mid-80s, maybe 86. If you're on the YouTube, I will go ahead and put that year up there. It's the movie with Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson, which I actually watched a bunch of clips of and was interesting because in my mind, it's like a very old romantic comedy. It came out in 1986 when I was 14 years old. And actually, I was in a very serious Danielle Steele immersion at that time. I really should have actually graduated to Nora Ephron. But I think of Nora Ephron predominantly with, When Harry Met Sally and Sleepless in Seattle. She wrote that memoir, I Feel Bad About My Neck, which I also really enjoyed. But this book, because it came out when I was young and was fairly quickly made into a movie, in my mind, it was always just a movie. So here are these young women introducing this book to me that came out when I was 14 years old, but I was very struck by the idea that this was something that would still resonate with them. And I went into this reading experience with all sorts of tropes in my mind about the romantic comedy. My expectations for it as a piece of literature were not super high. And I was so struck during my reading of how deftly Nora Ephron handles all of the tropes of the romantic comedy. This actually should not have been a surprise at all because she's kind of like the master of it. She only wrote the one novel, this one, Heartburn, and then very quickly moved on to writing screenplays, which actually makes a lot of sense in my mind. She is so good at them. But I loved dipping into this novel. And part of the reason for that is that, yes, she is very good at all of these tropes, but even from the very beginning, in her very first work in the genre, she's really pushing back against some of these stereotypes and some of these tropes, which was part of the real delight in digging into this book. So the things I was most impressed by, there are 4 of them, was actually the messiness of the structure. We're going to talk about the structure of this book because it is so odd. It's so bizarre. In many ways, it does feel like a first novel, but I also really appreciated the way that she used time and the way that she had these digressions that were actually pretty digressive, but really worked for me. I think that kind of messiness of structure actually really allowed her to go very deep and very broad, both in terms of plot and in terms of character. She does minor characters so well. The second thing I was really impressed by was the dialogue. This is not surprising, given that she then goes on to write screenplays. You can imagine in your mind that writing a screenplay has everything to do with dialogue. Her dialogue is so good. One of the things that I loved the most is there are a couple of passages as I was reading through that I was like, oh my gosh, this sounds exactly like When Harry Met Sally. I have not seen that movie for a long, long time, but I was reading a couple of these passages of dialogue and I was like, oh my gosh, I can just see Carrie Fisher and Meg Ryan just having exactly this banter between the two of them. The third thing I was very impressed by was the way that she wove this strain of cooking into the book. So cooking for me and recipes speaks to the domestic. It really speaks to what we are doing in private spaces. It speaks to women who are not being paid. It speaks in many ways to a traditional wife and a traditional marriage. And cookbooks and recipes, all of that is reinforcing, in many ways, for better and for worse, the idea largely that it is women who are at home cooking. So in this book, we have this really great way that she feathers in some recipes, a bunch of which, honestly, I will try. One of them made me laugh. It was where you take grapes and you cut them in half and put them in sour cream and brown sugar. And we absolutely had that when I was young, and I loved it. So delicious. But what she does with the domestic is kind of unexpected because we have this woman who is spending a lot of time in the kitchen in kind of the heart of the domestic area. She's also someone who is pregnant and has a young toddler. So she's really steeped in family life in many ways. But what she does with this domestic interest, this cooking that she is doing, is that she writes cookbooks. She keeps her maiden name. She makes some money. She feels independent. So there's this really interesting tension actually between every element that we're going to look at today, where it fits very neatly into the romantic comedy structures, but it also is pushing against them. The fourth thing I was impressed with was her sex writing. There's not a lot of it, but when there are little sections of it, which we're going to look at, they're so well done. So actually, those 4 elements will comprise today our agenda, how we're going to go ahead and approach this book. But before we do that, I want to talk briefly about the history of romantic comedy and about these tropes, what these tropes are, what these things that we expect from romantic comedy include. Okay, we're going to take a quick look at the history of the romantic comedy. So of course we have to just define the term from the top. It is really pretty obvious in many ways, but it is a subgenre of comedy and of romance. This seems very obvious. But it is interesting once you start looking in a slightly more granular way at this definition. So the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms has this: romantic comedies are comedies that deal with follies and misunderstandings of young lovers in light-hearted and happily concluded manners which avoid serious satire. And this does actually seem like a very apt description of what we are having here, but in many ways, what Nora Ephron is doing in Heartburn pushes against some of these, and we're going to look at the different ways that she is doing that. In many ways, it's much more interesting to look at a genre and to look at someone who is pushing against that genre. For me, it always ends up feeling more complex and more interesting, but this is the best because she still is preserving all of the excellence of the romantic comedy while also working outside of its confines. So in terms of the actual history, so back in the classical era of drama, meaning like theater, where we have like the Greeks and the Romans and Sophocles and Antigone and all of that kind of stuff, we had like a very sharp division between tragedy and comedy. Tragedy ends in death, comedy ends in marriage, which is really significant. Like by the time we get to Shakespeare in the late 16th, early 17th century, so like late 1500s, early 1600s, that idea is even more enforced. So any story that's going to end happily, like literally the definition of a comedy in Shakespeare, things like Midsummer Night's Dream or As You Like It, there are all sorts of, hijinks that happen, but they end in at least one marriage, sometimes 2. But this idea, of your Hollywood happily ever after, you don't have to really dig into happily ever after to understand that it has everything to do with matrimony. So we have these romantic comedies, they were not called that, back in the classic era, in the classical era, Greek and Roman. We have them in Shakespeare where they're really coming into full force. We then move into this kind of restoration comedy, which that is a restoration in England. You want to think of middle of the 1650s to the sort of beginning of the 1700s. I'm really embarrassed to say that I know the Restoration era, but I actually don't know what's being restored. But during this restoration, you have these comedies of manners. So what's happening there is we're taking a look and we're sort of doing a little bit of a send-up, but taking a look at all of these courtly manners. It's not chivalric, it's not a courtly novel, but it's looking at all of these high-class conventions, these social conventions that people needed to adhere to, and then a lot of the comedy came from exceptions of that, or people not understanding that, which actually is very close to the Oxford definition that we read above, the idea of follies and misunderstandings. So we have the Restoration comedy, and then we move into the 19th century, and this is the Romantic period, and suddenly things get very serious, and we have a lot of melodrama. The Romantic poets, there's a lot about love there, but the Romantic poets were really focused on death and the sublime. And when I say sublime, I mean the tininess of human life as compared to the vastness of nature. And then in the 20th century, we have these very interesting developments. In my mind, and this is so narrow-minded of me, in my mind, the rom-com sort of suddenly appeared maybe in the 80s, right around the time of, actually, in my mind, it really starts with When Harry Met Sally. But it turns out there's a very robust kind of history in the United States of the romantic comedy. So in the 30s, there's something called screwball comedies, which is really interesting because there's a lot of satire there. So that's pushing against this English definition, the Oxford Dictionary definition. And I actually don't know many movies from that era. I'm thinking of the one, the words that are popping into my mind are not As You Like It, that's Shakespeare. Some Like It Hot. I'm thinking it's even maybe Marilyn Monroe, maybe Tony Curtis. I'm not sure why these names are popping into my head. But in it, I think that the men are dressed as women. There's all this kind of playing with all of the conventions and kind of having these like goofy misunderstandings in order, I mean, in some ways they're kind of serious because what they're doing is they're underscoring either the arbitrariness or the coercion in some of these conventions that we have around love and marriage. So in the 30s, we have the screwball comedies. In the 40s and 50s, there was something called the career comedy, which I didn't recognize any of the titles, I have to admit. But I was so happy about this. This is making me think of the show Rhoda, which I don't actually really remember very well. But just by the name of it, you can imagine these are women who are entering the workforce in the 40s and 50s after the Second World War. And you can see, I mean, happily, there were some comedies that came out of that, but you can see the way that women entering the workforce and having actual careers, not just working jobs, would be really good fodder for any kind of genre that is really playing with the idea of traditional roles of husband and wife. We also have something during this era called the sex comedy, which, I mean, this is all from Wikipedia, people. You could go deeper into these, but the point in my kind of recognizing all of these different genres, screwball, career comedy, sex comedy, is to really point out that since there has been American cinema, there has been the romantic comedy. And what is interesting in that too is even as we are getting into Nora Ephron's movies, we do have this focus almost the whole entire time on the issue of fidelity and marriage. Throughout all of these, you know, the goal in When Harry Met Sally is to be married and to be married for a long time and be happily married. And happily, these days, we have all sorts of romantic comedies that are really pushing against that, but, you know, maybe not quite as hard as you might imagine. I, for one, am just so happy that people are not necessarily thinking that marriage is what they're going to do. I find that my children's generation, these 20-somethings, are really being very intentional and very conscious of the decisions they're making about marriage and about having children and whether or not they really want to be focused on their careers. They're questions that they're asking that I think do push against the precepts of the romantic comedy. And I'm happy that some of that is being shown also in television and movies too. Okay, now that we've covered the history of the romantic comedy, I want to move on to these tropes that I was referencing. And a trope is just a pattern. It's a pattern that you see again and again. So, for example, in romantic comedies, one of the tropes is that often these are young people. It's often like new love or first love. And what's interesting as we move through all of these tropes is it gives us an opportunity to discuss the ways that Nora Ephron is pushing against that. So in her book, the woman is 38 years old. She has been married once before. She is now married again. She is pregnant with her second child. So in many ways, this is not kind of like your young love, your kind of first love. And right from the start, she is dealing with a situation with infidelity and heartbreak, which often, I mean, I can understand certainly rom-coms. I'm sure there are examples of those, many probably, where we begin with someone who is heartbroken. But generally speaking, the rom-com is a young woman's game. The second trope is this idea of the meet cute. This came from, I think it's like Siskel and Ebert back in the day. I think it was Roger Ebert, maybe, who first used this term a lot. And it's basically like two people meeting in a cute way. But the way that they are thinking about it is that there's some sort of like meeting, some sort of encounter between two people. And usually it's pretty contrived. It's like some kind of crazy thing happens. Often you have a lot of awkwardness at this first meeting. You have like a clash of personalities. That is one of those really well-worn tropes where, you know, two people would like have a strong dislike for each other. And then, you know, at the end, when they end up being like falling madly in love, there is something about that kind of energy that we all are like, oh, obviously, that's what that was in the beginning. It was all of the sexual and romantic tension kind of flipped on its head. In Heartburn, once again, we have her really pushing against this idea. There is not a meet cute. In fact, the book opens when she's with her therapy group. For those of you who are younger, group therapy, you know, was like a big thing in the 70s and 80s. So this book came out in 1983. So she's, you know, in many ways, she's writing about the 70s. But the point is, it does not begin with some sort of meeting between her and the person who may or may not be her future love. In fact, it's beginning with basically the dissolution of her marriage, with the discovery of this infidelity. So definitely not a meet cute. So another one of these tropes that's very obvious is that as you are moving toward the goal of marriage, there are all these obstacles that you have to overcome. And this is the way, Nora Ephron, there actually are a lot of obstacles that she has to overcome. The bigger question here is whether or not the goal of this novel is marriage. And it was so interesting for me at some point to realize like, oh, wait, the whole point of this book, I'm always just wrapped up in the prose. I'm always wrapped up in like whatever's happening in a scene or the dialogue or, the words on the page. I kind of lose track of the larger plot. But at some point I was like, oh, right. Like we're going to have to find out if she's going to get back together with Mark or if she's not going to get back together with Mark. But right from the start, because we are seeing them in a really compromised situation, and frankly, because Mark is kind of a dick the whole time, it's really not, you do not get the sense that the whole goal of this is for her to be married or even to stay married. It's certainly not to get married because she already is married at this point. It's also really interesting to think that she had a first marriage, which we're going to get to her biography, and this book is very autobiographical. But certainly someone who has already had one marriage and who is working on her second marriage, that is not your typical rom-com plot. We also lots of times have the presence of like a sidekick, of kind of a girlfriend. I think in When Harry Met Sally, we can think of Carrie Fisher. We don't really have that here. She's got a couple of friends. Betty comes to mind, but you don't get the sense of one consistent person. And one of the things I liked about the book is it ends up feeling very confessional. She's really speaking very directly to the reader and really explaining things to the reader in a way that makes you, as the reader, kind of feel like you are that girlfriend. It's interesting to take a little step back and realize how she seems kind of isolated. She seems, not in a bad way, she seems very independent and kind of strong as she is working through this crisis. The last thing that I will talk about is in one of these tropes of the romantic comedy is usually we have a heroine who is very attractive. Sometimes it's like a little bit awkward, the attraction. I mean, the attractive nature of the person, but it's like Pretty in Pink or something like that. Like obviously Molly Ringwald is very pretty from the beginning. It's like, we have some crazy transformation and suddenly she's like prettier. I mean, for those of you who maybe are younger or have younger people in your lives, that the show that everyone's watching this summer is The Summer I Turned Pretty. So certainly the idea of being attractive is very important in these romantic comedies. And in Heartburn, we don't get the sense right away that this is an attractive person. In fact, her physical kind of being is not something that she is leading with. Then toward the very end, really toward the very, very end of the book, she says, I'm no beauty, blah, blah, blah. So we have this idea reinforced for us at the end that her physical beauty is not the thing that's most attractive about her. So I want to actually look at a passage that's toward the very end of the book. It's on page 175 in my copy, and my copy has 178 pages. So we're very much at the end. But what I want to look at here is the way that this kind of description of what she has been up to the whole time, what our narrator is really the conclusion that she is coming to. Think of all the ways that this pushes against the idea of these romantic comedy tropes. So on page 175, I looked across the table at Mark. I still love you, I thought. I still look at that dopey face of yours with that silly striped beard and think you are the handsomest man I've ever known. I still find you interesting, even if right now you're being more boring than the Martin Agronsky show. I don't know what that is. But someday I won't anymore, and in the meantime, I'm getting out. I am no beauty, and I'm getting on in years, and I have just about enough money to last me 60 days, and I'm terrified of being alone, and I can't bear the idea of divorce, but I would rather die than sit here and pretend it's okay. I would rather die than sit here figuring out how to get you to love me again. I would rather die than spend 5 more minutes going through your drawers and wondering where you are and anticipating the next betrayal and worrying about whether my poor, beat-up, middle-aged body with its cesarean scars will ever turn you on again. I can't stand feeling sorry for myself. I can't stand feeling like a victim. I can't stand hoping against hope. I can't stand sitting here with all this rage turning to hurt then to tears. So honestly, I cannot think of a better encapsulation of something that is pushing against all of these romantic comedy tropes. And what's really nice about this concluding thing toward the end of the book is that it is very much a piece. This is not surprising. This really grows organically about what we have seen earlier in the book. At the close of the lecture, we're gonna look at the very last part of the book itself. And in many ways, it's very sweet and it says different things about love. The book ends up having a lot of thoughts about love, and those thoughts about love are not necessarily congruent with this idea that love equals marriage. So this idea of love, of pushing against these tropes of romantic comedy, is a very good segue into the biography of Nora Ephron. Part of the reason why I've reversed, usually we would do the biography and then I would talk about the book itself, but I structured the lecture like this because reading that passage where our protagonist, Rachel Samstadt, is really articulating kind of her conclusion and the main thrust of the book, I think it has everything to do with the kind of verve and the sass and the independence that we see throughout the biography of Nora Ephron. So she was born in 1941 in New York City, but she was raised in Beverly Hills. She died in 2012. I remember when she died, and at that point, I liked that one book that she wrote, I Feel Bad About My Neck. And of course, I liked the romantic comedies, but I wasn't like a huge Nora Ephron devotee. But I remember it being very sad because she had cancer. And interestingly, and very fittingly, she didn't want to tell many people because she didn't want it to impede her career. So this is someone who is really very ambitious and who takes her career very seriously. So I did not remember that she was behind Silkwood. Remember that movie? It was so upsetting, frankly. But it really speaks to the fact that she was someone who was very serious about her career. She had worked before she began, doing her screenplays. She had worked before that writing columns for Esquire and working for different news outlet type things. She was actually part of a thing, I believe it was at Newsweek, where they wouldn't hire female writers. This was when she was first out of college. She went to Wellesley. And I believe they brought a lawsuit and really pushed hard against this idea that women should be hired to be doing these important journalistic jobs. So she was behind Silkwood. She then, Heartburn, the movie, came out in 1986. When Harry Met Sally came out in 1987, she wrote all of those screenplays. She wrote and then also began directing in the 90s. So she did Sleepless in Seattle in 1993. You've Got Mail in 1998, which I don't remember loving that one quite as much. And the title is just so funny, that whole AOL thing. And then I actually didn't really notice the fact that she also was a director and a creator of Julie and Julia, which is a movie I love. Interesting, that kind of gets off the path of the typical rom-com. It is really not about marriage. It's much more about women and ambition and their careers. But it's also very nice the way that the focus on cooking in that reflects this idea, the germ in the very beginning of her first novel, which was this Rachel character who was a cookbook writer. So she was someone who had a lot of professional ambition, and it's very easy to see where that came from because both of her parents were screenwriters. In the book, her mother is an agent, a talent agent for actors. But even before I had looked up her biography, I was like, this depiction of the mother in Heartburn really feels like it is built on someone who is real. And in fact, it is very much an autobiographical novel. So it is really leaning hard into the ambition of Nora Ephron's mother, which is interesting because Nora was born in 1941. She's the eldest of 4 daughters. So her mom, she was working through the 30s and 40s, which is impressive to me that this is a time when it would not have been standard for a woman to be out in the work world doing the same job as her husband. Of those 4 daughters, all of them were writers in some capacity or another. Delia Ephron is a name that was very familiar to me in a lot of the popular media that I have seen. So I was very curious as I was reading through Heartburn and understanding that it was fairly autobiographical. I really wanted to know how autobiographical. And sure enough, she had been married 3 times. And one of those husbands, this really seemed like something I should know, is Carl Bernstein of the Watergate scandal, Woodward and Bernstein. And in fact, the book is dedicated to Maria and Bob. Turns out that is Maria and Bob Woodward. There was such a funny thing about how, she seems so sassy and so amazing to me. Apparently for a long time, nobody knew the identity of Deep Throat, but she would just go around telling people. They'd be like, oh my gosh, has Carl figured out who Deep Throat is? And she'd be like, yeah, it's Mark Felt, which I do think that's actually the name of the guy. But you can see where she would be kind of subversive and flippant and really flying in the face of certain elements of authority. She helped write All the President's Men. She was married to him for a while, had 2 sons with him. He had an affair with a woman named Margaret, who at the time was married to the American ambassador to Britain, or maybe it was the other way around, the British ambassador to the United States. So in so many ways, Heartburn really does map right onto her biography. So we're now going to take just a quick moment to talk about the messiness of the structure of this book. I don't think this is something that your average reader would have clocked right away. She does it so well, and she moves back and forth in time so easily that it doesn't feel like you're ever kind of unmoored or you don't know where you are in time. And as I said before, I think it really allows her to explore a lot of different things throughout the book. When you step back, the plot of this book is actually kind of insane. And I want to just walk through this very quickly just to kind of impress upon you everything that she's getting up to here. So we're going to look at the very beginning of the book, but she starts with the idea of this group therapy that she's in. This is this group in New York City where she's pregnant, and she's telling them about the fact that her husband, Mark, is having an affair, and she does not know what to do. She is notably from the start turning the whole thing into a joke. And the idea of controlling the story, the idea of telling the story you want to tell, is something that is very important at the end. It's noteworthy that at the beginning, the way she's telling the story is in a lighthearted way that really allows her actually to process it. So then we go back in time. At that time, when she's with the group, she's also staying in her father's apartment. Her parents are actually like a fairly large presence in Heartburn, which I really liked. But the digression that we have with the mom is an example of this kind of digression. I think it's an important digression because if we are seeing the way that the mom is working and the importance of her career, even when she's in the hospital, she's like still doing her job, even toward the end of her life. And it seems in some ways just like a digression, but it's actually doing a lot of work in terms of convincing the reader of the way that Rachel does value her professional career and the way that she is someone who is independent and definitely doesn't see herself only as a wife. We then, there's another time when we have that major digression where we have the robbery, where we have the scene where she's on the subway and she drops her ring down into her bra, and then she's in her group therapy session and the man from the subway busts in with the gun. I mean, this is like high drama. And in some ways, it's like such a weird thing to be including. And there were times where I was like, this is maybe a little more drama than I need, a little more action than I want. But I actually think she mostly got away with it. We have a whole digression where we have her former marriage with Charlie and all the stuff about the hamsters. Some of that stuff, again, got like a little bit corny for me or a little bit unlikely, but really a lot of it worked. We then have this whole digression with Arthur and Julie. And throughout, all Arthur and Julie are their friends. You know, they have sort of that foursome, and they've traveled together a lot. And that's one of those times where we see her moving back and forth in time. So as we are having all of these digressions, she's also moving back and forth in time, talking about her relationship early with Mark, how she met him, and how literally everyone was like, he's not a great dude. And then they do the dancing thing. And he's like, you know, basically saying that she needs to follow him. And she's like, wait, what? I need to follow you? I mean, they're very consistent seeds of the idea of this Rachel pushing against the idea of being limited by her husband. But also, there's an enormous amount, and I found this so compelling, there's an enormous amount through the book about how painful this is and how awful it is. And it's painful for her, but it's also painful for the other people she's talking to. The idea of infidelity on some level is really normalized in the book, but also it is not made out to be something that's not painful. It really is something that's very painful for her. But in these moments of moving forward and backward in time, like we have the story of their proposal on Eastern Airlines, and Mark apparently has proposed to her over and over and over, which that's one of those things that you could see as coming from real life. I mean, a lot of this you can. But he finally proposes on Eastern Airlines, and it's really great because she is juxtaposing that with this plane flight when she and Mark are heading back to Washington after she has essentially forgiven him. We also have that digression when we went back in time to the birth of her first son. So there is so much that is happening in this book. And if you're someone who read it and, you know, read it as kind of like a light, fun thing, it is that. It is a light, fun thing. And it's very impressive that she's allowed, that she can cover this much territory and have these kinds of digressions that are important, but she's kind of mushing all of this stuff in a way that might be jarring and uncomfortable to the reader. And it is not. It's really well done. Okay, we're going to take a slightly closer look at the text itself. We're going to look briefly at dialogue, at the way that she kind of incorporates all of this sort of domestic stuff while also really remaining outside the domestic sphere, and then her look at sex and infidelity. So these passages of dialogue are so impressive. And again, I absolutely see why she moved, to the screenplay. So this is the conversation between our narrator, Rachel, and her good friend, Betty, and they're talking about Thelma Rice and who Thelma Rice is maybe having her affair with. Which, of course, there is so much dramatic irony in this book because we know that he's having an affair with Thelma Rice. So a lot of the magic of this dialogue is that we have information that these characters do not have yet. So on page 8, "Of course I'm sure," said Betty. "The question is who?" She thought for a minute. "Maybe it's Senator Campbell." She said, "He's talking about condominiums too." "Senators always talk about condominiums," I said. "That's true," said Betty. "But who else could it be?" This is another thing that I loved about this book. There was so much information about Washington, D.C., and I really loved hearing about all of that. So Betty says, "Who else could it be?" "I'll ask Mark," I said, which of course is hilarious because Mark is in fact having the affair with Thelma. "Do you think Thelma Rice is having an affair with Senator Campbell?" I said to Mark that night. So this is so genius. She says, "I'll ask Mark," I said. And then without a paragraph break, there's no space break, we zip right into her dialogue with Mark. And the repetition of it there is so good. And the genius here too is that when she says, "I'll ask Mark," the reader knows what is happening here. And the reader's like, "Oh God, it turns out your husband Mark he's the one who's having the affair." But then she ratchets up the tension because the very next line is her asking Mark that question. So the line with Betty is, "I'll ask Mark," I said. And then we go right into, "Do you think Thelma Rice is having an affair with Senator Campbell?" I said to Mark that night. "No," he said. "Well, she's having an affair with someone," I said. "How do you know?" he said. "She's talking about buying a condominium if Jonathan is sent to Bangladesh," I said. "Jonathan's not going to be sent to Bangladesh," said Mark. "Why not?" I said. "Because we still care about Bangladesh," said Mark. "Then Upper Volta," I said. Mark shook his head as if he couldn't believe he'd been dragged into such a hopelessly girlish conversation. Which is so interesting to me. I mean, the idea of Upper Volta, this is dialogue of a woman who knows what her husband is up to. She understands his job. She understands the nuance of diplomacy. There's a lot of subtle stuff that's happening in this dialogue that's really speaking to her intelligence. Intelligence is not always put on as a premium in these rom-coms, and she's definitely doing that. It's excellent. So Mark is shaking his head, the girly conversation. He went back to reading House and Garden, which is also funny because that's kind of a girly magazine. Shortly after that, the talk of condominiums stopped. "Thelma's not talking about condominiums anymore," Betty called up to say one day. "What do you think it means?" "Maybe it's over," I said. "No," said Betty, "it's not over." "How do you know?" I said. "She had her legs waxed," said Betty, and then, very slowly added, "for the first time." And then, even more slowly, "and it's not even summer yet." So this is so deft. She's talking to Betty in the beginning, then we jump in this very clear, but like kind of savvy and interesting way into the conversation with Mark. And there's all sorts of funny things happening. And then we're jumping back out into the conversation with Betty. There's so much economy here. And it ends with this kicker where we have this unexpected response when Rachel says, "How do you know she's still having the affair?" That she had her legs waxed. And then this kind of pause, and then "for the first time." So that's really speaking about Thelma. It's speaking in this very kind of coded language. And then we have this even more exaggerated thing about how it's not even summer yet. It is so well done. Now we're going to move on and talk about the ways that she is incorporating the idea of domesticity, but a domesticity that is a job. It's like a professional domesticity, which is kind of an oxymoron, but that's what's so beautiful about it. So on pages 16 and 17, this is very early in the novel. "That's my name, Rachel Samstat. It's always been Rachel Samstat. I held on to it through both my marriages. Through the first, because I never liked my husband's last name enough to change mine to it, and through the second, because I was, by then, known in a small and modest way as Rachel Samstat. The cookbooks I write do well. They're very personal and chatty. They're cookbooks in an almost incidental way. I write chapters about friends or relatives or trips or experiences, and I work in the recipes peripherally." So what's so fun about this is, of course, she's doing that here again. Like what we are reading, Heartburn is not, in fact, a cookbook. I can't believe I haven't talked about the title until now. The title of this book is insanely great. It's so good. I even like the cover art. If you're on the YouTube, I'm showing you my cover art here. It's such a great bridge between the idea of heartbreak and also getting burned, like by your husband being unfaithful to you, but also heartburn because of all of the cooking and all of the indigestion. It's just absolute genius. So on 16 and 17, where she's talking about her name, it's so elegant because she's telling us a lot of different things all at the same time. On pages 21 and 22, and this has a lot to do with her Jewish heritage, Nora Ephron and her whole family, there was a description that I read about how she wasn't like a super faithful person and didn't really practice a lot of Judaism, but she was deeply Jewish in a cultural sense. There's a lot of emphasis in the book about Judaism, about being Jewish, that is very well done. So on the bottom of 21, "I was not raised as a Jewish princess. Sometimes I'm accused of being one because I'm not exactly the outdoor type. which I thought was so funny. I mean, she's really pushing against the stereotype of a Jewish princess in a way that's light. It's just really very good. So she's not the outdoor type. But I grew up a scrappy little athlete with a scrappy little mother who wanted me to have a flashy career like her own. I wonder what she would have made of my work. My mother was a good recreational cook, but what she basically believed about cooking was that if you worked hard and prospered, someone else would do it for you, which is so excellent. I always love it when someone's just really unapologetic about not doing things that society expects them to do. So then we have a paragraph break. My mother was an agent in Hollywood, a lady agent, a classic 40s career woman. She had short hair and bangs, she wore suits with shoulder pads, and she talked in a gravelly voice. So right here we have this really excellent, very pithy description, but then we also get this excellent digression when her mother is in the hospital, which really develops both of them so nicely. The last thing we're going to read about this kind of domestic cookbook business is on 133. And this is such a deft way. I mean, all of these elements that we have here, yes, she's doing this domestic thing in this professional way, but then she takes the extra step to talk about why cooking is interesting to her. So the whole thing is deepened really considerably for the reader. On page 133, we have this. But most cooking is based on elementary, long-standing principles. And to say that cooking is creative not only misses the point of creativity, which is that it's painful and difficult and quite unrelated to whether it is possible to come up with yet another way to cook a pork chop, but also misses the whole point of cooking, which is that it is totally mindless. What I love about cooking is that after a hard day, there's something comforting about the fact that if you melt butter and add flour and then hot stock, it will get thick. It's a sure thing. It's a sure thing in a world where nothing is sure. It has a mathematical certainty in a world where those of us who long for some kind of certainty are forced to settle for crossword puzzles. Gosh, love it. I love the levity of the end of that, but she's also really talking about this very strong need for comfort and the ways that we do think of cooking and cooking for other people as a gesture of comfort, but she's doing it in a way that is really outside the confines of kind of like the normal family expectations. This is a decent time to say that she's got this 2-year-old kid and she's pregnant. There's quite a bit made about her being pregnant-ish, but I was actually very impressed because we do have these two, she's pregnant and then she also has the baby, and they are not front and center. And there's not a lot of angst about like her not being with them or, whether or not she's getting a babysitter. Like she just sidesteps the whole question of maternity in a way that is so good. I think the reason why I say that, like why I'm so impressed by that and so like inspired by that, is that, society has huge expectations for every woman who has a toddler and who is pregnant. We had all those mommy wars. I'm sure they're still going on. I've just kind of like checked out of the maternal zone. But like this, you can't do right. If you go back to work, that's terrible. If you stay at home, that's terrible. Women, it is so difficult. It is so hard. So I was very inspired by this idea that she's like not even like she's not even going to entertain those questions. She's just going to do the thing the way she wants to do it, which is move through this crisis in a very independent way and really emphasize her own reactions and emotions and also her own career. It's really great. Okay, we're going to talk now about the idea of infidelity, and the way that she writes about sex. So those of you who are longtime listeners to the Fox page know that I am someone who got married young. I am really committed to my marriage and to monogamy, but I am always fascinated because this stuff is private. I mean, it's just very difficult. It's something that is central in many people's lives, and it's very strange in some ways to have that be so isolated. I do not like erotica. I don't really like writing. I don't like reading about sex. Like I don't like reading sex passages particularly. But I'm always interested in people's attitudes and kind of like broad strokes. Oh my God, no pun intended. Like broad strokes about how people feel about different sexual practices, all sorts of different things. And this book was really interesting to me because she is absolutely crushed by the idea of her husband as, having had this affair. But it turns out that she at one point also had an affair. She's someone who married her first husband young, and really, feels very good about having gotten out of that marriage. So it's really someone whose experience of sexual interaction and certainly of marriage is pretty different from mine. And I really was interested in like getting a view into how Nora Ephron, as a stand-in for many other women, And she does come to feel like a stand-in, at least for her group of women. I mean, you get a sense of all of these women's attitudes, whether or not you should stay after, your husband has been unfaithful, what infidelity means, what it doesn't mean. All of those things are writ large in a way that I found fascinating. So on page 11, it doesn't matter how smart you are if both your husbands manage to prove how dumb you are as easily as mine had. Of course, my fling with the man in the hotel room happened a long time ago, before my divorce, before I met Mark, before I decided to marry him and become an incorrigible believer in fidelity. It is, of course, hideously ironic that the occasion for my total conversion to fidelity was my marriage to Mark, but timing has never been my strong point. So what I love about this is that, of course, when she says she's an incorrigible believer in fidelity, this is something she has converted to. She has very strong feelings about it now, but those are feelings that can change. And she's very light about the fact that she was unfaithful to her other husband. There's something, I don't even know why, there's something about her attitude, her flexible thinking about the importance of monogamy and fidelity. So we're going to move quickly through just 3 quick passages where she's talking about sex. I found them so funny and light and kind of like oddly detailed in ways that were very appealing. On page 19, she's talking about someone she dated. He was so Jewish when I dated him that he taught Hebrew school, and I, who at that point had had no Jewish education whatsoever, learned about Purim and good Queen Esther and the wicked Haman from him one night in a dormitory at Harvard while he stuck 1 and then 2 and then 3 fingers into me. Which, this is the kind of thing, I'm fascinated by it. Then we move on, and she says this thing that's so great. This was before the discovery of the clitoris, when there was far too much sticking of fingers into things and not nearly enough playing around with the outsides. So I love this. I had an MFA teacher who said that the best way to write about sex is simply say what is happening. No metaphors, no descriptions of how things feel on the skin or whatever, but really just say what is happening and then allow the reader to have her reaction. She's saying such an important thing here, which is like, this is before the discovery of the clitoris. I mean, I think she means maybe her own, but also it is like the world's discovery of the clitoris. At one point she talks about on the coffee table, when the moving man is coming, he's looking at like the diagram of the vagina in Our Bodies, Ourselves. And in 1 minute, we're going to see where she references the joy of sex. This was a time, in the 70s where people were really beginning to understand female anatomy and pleasure better. And I just loved the levity, but also just like the candor in this small passage. And then on 64, we have something that's equally brief, but also just like seemed like very sex positive. On 64. Oh, this is when she was like, she just couldn't believe that someone would skip meals to have sex. And in fact, it's Mark. And she's like thinking like, oh my gosh, wait, like is his libido changed? Like, is he just going crazy about sex now? But then she remembered that in the beginning, they also, Rachel and Mark, had very lively sex. Had I forgotten the first months of our courtship, the hours and hours of sex, the smell of it everywhere, in the air, on the sheets, on my hands, in my hair? Had I managed to forget all that? Of course I hadn't. On the other hand, we never once had less than 3 meals a day, so there. So of course I like the return to the food part, but also this idea of the smell of sex as being everywhere in her hands and her hair, like that's a pretty revealing and kind of, I mean, I really loved that passage. I love the idea of someone who's being really honest about spending, weeks in bed with someone. And she's talking here about the potency of sex without having to like add a lot of sex scenes and not to talk about things explicitly. I think for some readers, like the smell of sex in her hair is you're probably like, oh my God. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a little off-putting for you, but I found it very inspirational. So on page 116 and 17, this is a snippet of dialogue between Rachel and her friend Julie. And Julie is someone who stayed in a marriage after her husband Arthur was unfaithful to her. And what's nice about this too is I'm going to read a little section that gives an indication of how difficult this experience, the experience of having your husband be unfaithful, how difficult that is. Julie's advice is that she just has to ride it out. She needs to just like sit there and just like let Thelma and Mark get tired of each other. So Rachel says, "And I'm supposed to sit there like a lox in the meantime?" "Yes," said Julie, "if you want to stay married." "That's a terrible thing to say," I said. "I know," said Julie, "but it works. I did it. Sometimes I don't know why I did it, because it's so horrible and painful and humiliating. waiting the damn thing out. Sometimes I think I'd been better off if I'd just left. Aren't you glad you're still with Arthur? Oh, sure, said Julie. Then what is it? I don't know, said Julie. Sometimes the idea of being single interests me. For example, I woke up this morning and realized I'm never going to have bondage. Which is so funny. I'm never going to have bondage is just like a funny way to put that. It's just never going to come up with me and Arthur. I don't want to have it particularly, but it's never going to come up. I've never done it either, I said. Though I guess if I wanted to, I could always ask. Which, yes, good modeling there, Rachel. Arthur would just laugh at me, said Julie. Although I'm not sure what Mark would tie me to. Arthur would just laugh at me, said Julie. And then Rachel says, although I'm not sure what Mark would tie me to, since we don't have a headboard. You pretty much need a headboard, don't you think? I don't know, said Julie. That's the whole point. I guess you could always check into a hotel, I said. Hotel beds have headboards. You could call room service for the rope, said Julie. It's really bad, isn't it, I said. It's always bad when it happens, said Julie, and then it gets better. You'll see. In a while, you'll be able to spend entire 15-minute periods without thinking about what they did together. So I love here this mixture of compassion. I mean, really, Julie is speaking to the difficulty and the pain of this experience, which Nora Ephron really puts so well in this book. But I also love the idea of these women talking about bondage and like this kind of like nuts and bolts thing about it, about the headboard and whatnot. It's kind of a sidestepping, like they're curious about it, but it's nice and light. There's a lot of levity about like the details that they are thinking about. So the last thing I want to look at is on page 129. So this is really late in the book. Importantly, this is after she and Mark are still trying to work things out, but things are very contentious. And what she's talking to here is the idea of whether or not, even when things were very contentious, whether they were having sex together. So she says on 129, perhaps you're wondering whether we had sex. Normally, I don't like to get into this area because it embarrasses me, which I liked that little confession. But since it's probably crossed your mind, I'd better deal with it. We had sex. We always had sex. That's one of the most perplexing parts of the story. That's one of the reasons why Mark's relationship with Thelma had come as such a big surprise to me. Now that I look back on it, we hadn't been doing anything particularly inventive in that department of late, but I have never been big on invention in that department. Why kid around? Every so often I browse through books full of tasteful line drawings of supplementary positions, how to do it standing and in the swimming pool and on the floor, and I'm always mystified. On the floor? Why would anyone want to do it on the floor when a bed was available? I'll tell you the truth. Even sex on a beach seems to me to be going too far. So what I like about this is how honest it is and how matter-of-fact it is, and just kind of unapologetic. This is a woman who knows what she likes, and she's going to tell us what she likes. It's also someone who was talking about the smell of sex in her hair. So this is not like someone who's really repressed, but I like the idea of her just being like, I'm just a no-nonsense kind of person where sex is concerned. But she's also sort of giving us the sense that it was, at a minimum, a very important way for the two of them to connect, but then also maybe something that she enjoyed. We're going to close today. I'm just going to read a couple of things from the end of the book. I'm not going to analyze them at all, but I'm just going to treat you to her amazing prose, but also the way that this book is pushing against the idea of marriage. This is a book that ends with a lot of affirmation about the importance of love, the power of love, but not necessarily within the confines of marriage, which is so inspirational. So on page 164, this is when her obstetrician is asking her if she believes in love. And before I read this, it's important to recognize, he says, do you believe in love? And then the paragraph where she begins, sometimes I believe that love dies, the paragraph that follows, she's not saying anything to him. She's just like saying things to the reader. It's a longish paragraph that she's thinking in her head, and it's very powerful, but she's not actually speaking anything until the very end. Do you believe in love? He said. Sometimes I believe that love dies, but hope springs eternal. Sometimes I believe that hope dies, but love springs eternal. Sometimes I believe that sex plus guilt equals love, and sometimes I believe that sex plus guilt equals good sex. Sometimes I believe that love is as natural as the tides, and sometimes I believe that love is an act of will. Sometimes I believe that some people are better at love than others, and sometimes I believe that everyone is faking it. Sometimes I believe that love is essential, and sometimes I believe that the only reason love is essential is that otherwise you would spend all your time looking for it. Yes, I said, I do. I loved this so much. First of all, genius that the whole thing is just like it's a whole string of sometimes. It's like she's really throughout the whole entire book giving a lot of lateral, a lot of room for herself and for everyone else to be having all these feelings about love because it is complicated and about infidelity and about marriage. It's just genius with the sometimes and sometimes and how she's flip-flopping things. It's really beautiful. It's also excellent that her obstetrician says, "Do you believe in love?" And then we have this long paragraph, and then she ends with, "Yes, I said, I do." So the idea of her saying, "I do," at the end of a little part about love, like actually kind of a big paragraph about love, is so genius. Usually "I do" would have to do with marriage, but here she's using "I do," I think very purposefully, because then there's a nice big space break, so it really has a lot of emphasis. This idea of "I do" is not reinforcing like the marriage vow, it's reinforcing this idea that she does believe in love. It's so well done. So we're going to finish up by looking at pages 176 through 178. Of course, I'm writing this later, much, much later, and it worries me that I've done what I usually do. Hidden the anger, covered the pain, pretended it wasn't there for the sake of the story. Why do you feel you have to turn everything into a story? Vera once asked me. And then a little further down, Vera repeats that question. Why do you feel you have to turn everything into a story? So I told her why. Because if I tell the story, I control the version. Because if I tell the story, I can make you laugh. And I would rather have you laugh at me than feel sorry for me. Because if I tell the story, it doesn't hurt as much. Because if I tell the story, I can get on with it. So beautiful. Really, really well done. So then she has a paragraph about her last day in Washington. She knows that she's going to leave. And then we have this really kind of curious and beautiful moment where she and Mark are in bed, and she's really musing about love. So on 177, we got into bed and Mark put his arms around me. That was a lovely evening, he said. He fell asleep. I lay there. 2 years earlier, when I had been pregnant with Sam, Mark would sing me a song every night and every morning. We called it the Petunia song. It was a dumb song, really. Mark would make up a different tune and lyrics each time, but it never rhymed, and it was never remotely melodious. So then she has some songs which I'm not going to sing to you. You get the idea. Really dumb. But every time Mark sang it, I felt secure and loved in a way I had never dreamed possible. I had always meant to write down some of the words because they were so silly and funny and made me feel so happy, but I never did. And now I couldn't remember them. I could remember the feeling, but I couldn't remember the words, which was not the worst way to begin to forget. So good. So excellent. And at the back of my book, we have this great recipe index. She tells us where all of the recipes are and what they are, which honestly, if I try these out, I'll let you guys know. So I thought this ending was so beautiful. It was a really good way to be sort of straightforward and actually very compassionate and very forthcoming about the difficulties and sort of more like the heaviness of the novel, which I think she does the perfect balance throughout of things feeling light, but also feeling like they have enough gravitas. So I really hope that you have enjoyed this examination of the rom-com and all the ways that this book in particular, but Nora Ephron in general, was so good at pushing against some of these tropes while also really digging into them in a way that is very appealing. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.